Hello, welcome everyone. My name is Nadia Ali. I'm the director of the Center for Middle East Studies here at Brown University, where I'm also professor of anthropology and Middle East Studies. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to today's event. Today we will be in conversation with Evren Savcı to discuss her recently published book, Queer in Translation, Sexual Politics under Neoliberal Islam. In the book, Evren analyzes the travel and translation of Western LGBT political terminology to Turkey in order to illuminate how sexual politics have unfolded under Recep Tayyip Erdoğan's AKP government. And I'm very happy to co-host today's event with my colleague here at Brown, Banu Özkazançpan. Banu is professor of practice at the School of Engineering. She is also currently co-editor-in-chief of the journal Gender, Work and Organization. And the journal is actually part of co-hosting today's event. Hello, Banu.
Nadia, hi. It's so nice to be here and welcome to everyone. I wanted to take a moment and introduce our wonderful guest speaker today, Evren Savcı. I'm going to read her bio for everyone to learn about her work. So Evren Savcı is an assistant professor of the Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies program at Yale University. Her first book, the one we'll be discussing here today, Queer in Translation, Sexual Politics under Neoliberal Islam, analyzes sexual politics under contemporary Turkey's AKP regime with an eye to the travel and translation of sexual political vocabulary. Her second book project, tentatively entitled Failures of Modernization, Polygamy, Islamic Matrimony, and Cousin Marriages in the Turkic Republic, turns to sexual practices that were deemed uncivilized and either heavily discouraged or outlawed by the Turkish Republic. Evren's work on the intersections of language, knowledge, sexual politics, neoliberalism, and religion has appeared in the Journal of Marriage and the Family, Ethnography, Sexualities, Political Power and Social Theory, Theory and Event, Journal of Feminist Studies and Religion, GLQ, a Journal of Lesbian, Gay, and Studies, and several edited collections. So she is well published, and we are very excited to have her speak with us today.
Welcome, Evren. So I'm going to start with the first question, but I should say, so for the audience, you're welcome to leave your questions or comments in the Q&A function, and we should have some time towards, the last 20 minutes, half an hour for questions. So please go ahead. So Evren, when I was reading your book, I was sort of thinking how many of us are shocked by the extreme shifts we have seen unfold in Turkey. I mean, there was this period of hope. I certainly myself had been working on Iraq, when I was looking to Turkey, I mean, there was this hope, democratization and a sort of general opening that allowed for a level of dissident politics that you didn't see in some other countries in the region. There was the peace process with the Kurdish political movement, and also very much so a very active feminist and a very active and dynamic feminist and queer activist mobilization. Now, when we look to Turkey today, we see widespread political repression, the crushing of dissent, and sort of extremely conservative politics of gender. And you in your book are arguing that the answers, in terms of this shift, this radical shift, that they lie in what you call the marriage between neoliberalism and Islam. And this is developed by the AKP regime. So could you explain to us what you mean by that, this marriage between neoliberalism and Islam, and how has it contributed to this radical shift?
Yes, of course. Thank you so much, Nadia, too. I want to say quickly thank you both to Nadia and Banu for inviting me and for having this conversation with me today, and to Barbara for organizing this. So neoliberal Islam, I want to say also off the bat, is not my term. So some scholars of Turkey had been writing about this, but I do come to it from a queer studies perspective, which I think we'll also have a chance to talk about a little bit. So for me, what's interesting in neoliberalism in general is the moralization of the economy And in the case of neoliberal Islam, how that particular moralization takes an alleged Islamic kind of undertone, let's say. It's not so much of an undertone, let's call it a tone. What I do in terms of sort of like following certain scholars of neoliberalism, but then thinking about how neoliberalism and Islam come together, is to suggest that if neoliberal capitalism is a system that produces increasing precarity for larger groups of people, and we're seeing this all over the world, this is not unique to Turkey. And by increasing precarity, I mean the disappearance of the middle class, the rise of surplus existence, the disappearance of welfare and social safety nets, rising dispossession, rising debt, household debt, but student debt, other kinds of debt, and crushing of labor unions. So there's really not that many ways to organize. So there are some interesting shifts happening now. There's some interesting unionizations too. There are responses to this. So if this is happening already, and if the system justifies such inequality via moralizing mechanisms, so production of categories of deserving and undeserving, rise of respectability politics, and emphasis on individualization of responsibility, especially so individual failures, individual successes, it's how the system presents everything, and an emphasis on self-sufficiency and self-entrepreneurialism. So if this is the way in which inequality is justified, I suggest in the case of Turkey, Islamic morality factors as the key mechanism through which neoliberalism gets domesticated. So through which the government designates between the deserving and the undeserving, between the good moral citizens and the bad immoral elements, conspiring with foreign powers, often right for the government's downfall, and between those who need to be securitized and those who will aid with such securitization. And I find that queer politics ends up being a really interesting site from which to understand these changes and the resistances to it. So as I said, in many ways, I'm interested in the moralization of economic behavior. And one quick thing I'll add to this too is also, in the case of Turkey, I talk about how the Turkish economy itself becomes this kind of almost magical entity that gets directly securitized. So the moralization, as I said, is married with a government-defined form of Islam, and the Turkish economy is presented continuously as under threat, usually by foreign lobbies, but there are internal elements aiding those lobbies. So the Turkish economy is presented as in need of protection and of security measures, and those who are understood to be security threats to the nation and the national economy, which is continuously privatized, so I think it's a bit funny to call it the national economy, are also framed as morally suspect. Like one of the examples I give in the book is how, as the Gezi Park uprisings were unfolding, which consisted of people who were demonstrating against the privatization of a public park and the turning of it into a shopping mall, they were being securitized and also rendered morally suspect by saying that they were entering a mosque with shoes on and drinking beer inside. So they're not just sort of securitized as terrorists, but also as immoral elements. And we've seen this marriage between the logic of and discourse of terrorism and immorality also very recently in the case of the Boğaziçi University incidents, which some of our audience might be familiar with.
Yeah, probably you need to explain that to those who are not, but I was also wondering if you could just follow up and again, to those in the audience who are not so familiar with the way that securitization actually plays out. If you could sort of elaborate a little bit and maybe provide some more examples.
Yes, of course. So I think one of the ways in which, in this sense, I find my work to be very much in conversation with Indar Palgrawal's latest book on sort of these private citizens who help with the national security. And what has been happening, which there are a lot of, even like the other day, one of the leaders of the kind of opposition parties was saying that Erdoğan presents the terrorist of the week every week, because the logic of terrorism has been used. I mean, the logic of terrorism, as anybody who's a little bit familiar with Turkish history and Turkish state's relationship with its Kurdish citizens and Kurdish regions, is not new. But what we have been seeing, which is one of the arguments I make in the book, is a deployment of marginality. So much larger groups of people are called terrorists, threats to the nation, and immoral elements. So what I mean by securitization is a particular government and state response to, like along with other scholars, I think of these as sort of dissidents towards increasing inequalities presented by neoliberalism. Like if you have an increasing gap between the poor and the rich, there will be uprisings inevitably. And that is part of an important shift from like kind of more traditional liberalism to neoliberalism. But then how do you respond to those uprisings and to those protests? And we've seen them all over the world with Occupy. Otherwise, there is an increasingly militarized police state in response. So these are the kinds of things that I have in mind. And in Turkey, we have seen a growing number of terrorists, quote unquote, according to government's rhetoric, which now captures such a wide variety of subjects who would never understand themselves as having to do anything with each other politically or otherwise, like from feminists to the Gülenist right wing to journalists who write about the Kurdish freedom movement, etc., etc. So this is sort of what I have in mind.
Great, thank you very much. Banu, would you like to follow up with the question?
Yeah, Evren, thank you so much. And I think we certainly see the securitization and militarization across the globe, including here in the US, on different scales. In thinking about your book project, it's so fascinating. And, you've discussed the fact that it didn't, really evolve linearly, but more organically. So can you share with us sort of that process of how did you over time, depending on the changing context, kind of write the book in its current form? How did it start and how did it come to take the shape that it is today?
Thank you, Banu. So I'll be very honest with my answer to this question, because I think for graduate students, it's good to hear different stories of how projects come into being. So when I first started my research was the summer of 2008, and that kind of corresponds to the time of hope that Nadia was describing at the beginning. And there were no, much of the things that I recount in the book were not happening just yet. So I was interested in queer organizing in LGBT movements in Turkey. I wasn't very satisfied with the accounts that I saw of LGBT organizing in the Middle East. I found it quite reductive and not very ethnographically informed in either way, in any case. So I thought, okay, I'm just gonna go hang out with queer activists and see how they understand their role in, changing the sexual landscape of the country. But then things started changing, and we spent a lot of time going back and forth to the field, and then the political story of Turkey started to shift. So then I shifted my focus. So the neoliberalism is not such a main part of the story in the dissertation, but in the book, it became the central story, and neoliberal Islam. The research itself, there's this, I do want to write about this someday. There's a very unscientific category that, I think like of instinct that all researchers rely on, but we can't account for it exactly, and we cannot teach it, and we cannot really claim it to be quote unquote scientific, at least in social sciences. But it is something I think a lot of people rely on. So when I was in the field and I was kind of seeing these disparate spaces of queer existence and queer politics or resistance to politics, I thought, okay, I'm not going to just stick with the activists. I'm just going to go look at these different sites, and I'm going to follow stories that seem to tell me something interesting, something different, and I will see how I can make sense of them over time. So this is why I said I'm just going to be very honest with it, because I know this is not what we recommend to, just go with your instinct and do whatever feels right. This is not how a research is designed and done. So then you have to have a plan, but I think it's good to be flexible with the plan. And in my case, things were shifting and changing so quickly that, I attended a meeting, a queer activist meeting at the very beginning of my research, where to a traveling gender studies class from the US, one of the activists said, as a response to, so the students asked, what's your relationship like to the leftist parties in the country? And the major left party in Turkey is the Republican People's Party. The activists said, we don't agree with a lot of the Republican People's Party politics. And at that point, there was a lot of kind of pro-military, we are asking the military to step in and do its, job kind of rhetorics also going around. So they said we actually find ourselves, well, this one person said, we find ourselves much closer to the AKP. Like this was uttered. Now this is unthinkable. This was unthinkable even a couple of years later, 2-3 years later. But so I also had to be a little bit flexible in my tracing of the shifts of a very, very slippery social ground.
No, thank you for that. And I think it's the crux of your work is to be able to trace the shifts and changes while keeping an eye on the subject of the study. So thank you for that. I know Nadia has some questions too, so I'll get back to her.
Yeah, I think the next question that I'm interested in is, to probe a little bit more on this idea of the multiplicity of Islam. So I understand that is also one of your aims in the book, to try to illustrate that and to show the multiplicity of those who live it and those who speak on behalf of Islam in a context where the Turkish government is, of course, trying very hard to control, this idea, what is Islam, and is trying very hard to homogenize its meaning. And you are very importantly, I think that is sort of at the center of what you're doing. You're proposing the concept of translation as a methodological solution to address the tensions, and also as a way to challenge this problematic binary between authentic, colonial, which is, of course, very much, it's something that we all grapple with. So, but what actually is critical translation studies, and how does translation help methodologically in the context of your work?
Yeah, thank you, Nadia, for that question. So yes, it wasn't, I guess maybe it's fair for me, or more like fair for me to say that the goal was not to trace the multiplicity of Islam, but it is inevitable to not write about it if you're writing about the context of Turkey and you're honestly looking at the social field in front of you. So I use critical translation studies to, as you said, to get out of the colonial authentic binary, but also a number of other binaries, such as, local and global, West and East, or global North, global South. And I have found the critical translation studies approach really helpful, especially because I locate myself in queer studies. Because one of the binds I found myself in as someone who's going to talk about queer existence and queer politics in Turkey, in the Middle East, are gay and lesbian as categories applicable, authentic? Are they Western positions, even by the activists themselves? And I find this to be an extremely tired conversation anyway, but I wanted to also find a way to explain why that doesn't work. And I think that to tie translation to the multiplicity of Islam, as you were framing the question, translation studies, first of all, historicizes language and does not think of what we think of language today as an authentic entity to any place in the world. So most of the entities we think of languages today are national categories that are results of huge amounts of violence and erasure of local and indigenous languages, their reduction to dialect. So to say that Arabic is more authentic than English or Turkish is more local than, this doesn't work from a critical translation studies perspective. So, and I do find that the historicization of language as well as other categories to be extremely important. Some of these have been, the sexual categories have been, like the history of sexuality is a big part of queer studies, but it hasn't been accompanied by a history of language, even though language is understood to be, from a structural perspective, as pretty much constitutive of the real. So, so with translation studies, I think of the travel of these terms that you mentioned as you were introducing the book as not simply being adopted directly or being rejected or playfully resignified, but as things that drop on a social field and create social disjunctures, which then tell us something about the social and political and economic dynamics in the field. So in one of the chapters of the book, I write about debates that were unfolding as LGBT rights, in a very abstract conceptual way, was being deployed to test headscarf activists to see whether they were open to all democratic rights, as they were asking for the right to wear the headscarf to public universities and public offices. And there are multiple Muslim voices, Muslim headscarf activist voices that I trace, like some who don't understand the comparison as relevant at all, like this equivalence between this right and this right are the same thing, departing from a liberal understanding of rights. Some think of homosexuality as an illness, and some think of it as a sin, but not as an illness. And all these were actually very lively debates that were all reduced to homophobia, which I find to be quite unfortunate, because politically they also corresponded to different positions. So for me, looking at this debate, the travel of LGBT rights to Turkey, and seeing what kind of debates unfolded through critical translation studies, means that I don't think of this as completely adopted, or like some liberal terms are adopted completely liberally by all subjects, but I show that even the liberal illiberal binary doesn't hold when it comes to how many Muslim headscarf activists talk about the right to the headscarf, that right to wear the headscarf. So for me, translation studies is important from a, obviously, thinking of particular categories, linguistic categories historically sense, but also to say that the language of the local as well as the local are also analytic categories, and they're multiple in reality. There is no the local, there is no the local Turkish response or the local Muslim response to homosexuality. Yeah. And if we pay attention to these disjunctures, we will see a much more interesting, richer, complex world.
Yeah. Just maybe could you sort of elaborate a little bit on this, how the way that women who wear headscarves speak about the right to wear headscarves, how does that challenge this liberal illiberal dichotomy?
Right. So I talk about a few, like I can give a couple of examples maybe. Yes. One is that the very term right in Turkish is hak. And that is itself a term that sort of travels between liberal and illiberal, because there are some very secular liberal uses of it, like insan hakları, which means human rights. But hak is also one of the 99 names of Allah, and it refers to a very capacious understanding of justice that some headscarf activists argued, and I kind of talk about those two a little bit, cannot be reduced to liberal rights. So the tension between justice and rights, which a number of scholars have written about, comes into play through the very term that can indicate multiple things at the same time, like it has multiple resonances. So that's one example. But also, there is a scene I describe at the end of this chapter where a few headscarf activists meet up with LGBT activists, and they use Judith Butler, who they have clearly read very well, to try to convince queer activists that they should give up on convincing the state to give them rights, because this kind of identity politics and like is inviting the state into your bedroom and is playing into the same kind of constricted sort of liberal, but they're using, so this also gets out of the authentic versus colonial binary, not just liberal illiberal, but you see when you read the columns or other kind of arguments of some of the headscarf activists that they're borrowing from various traditions, and there is no one authentic, untouched by modernity Islamic formula that they're harking back to. So that's what I have in mind.
Yeah, thank you. It's very helpful. Banu, over to you.
Yeah, actually, my question really dovetails nicely with sort of the complexity you present in terms of how you're thinking about local and Islams, I guess with an S. So in many ways, your book provides a critique of the ways that queer studies tends to deal with Islam with a capital I, right? And you're really talking about a productive paradox, I would say, that maybe neoliberal Islam posits to queer studies. So can you sort of expand a little bit more on what you're arguing in this book as it relates to that tension between, you know, queer studies, which is an amalgam of positions, as well as Islam, which also is a variety of different positions and positionalities?
Right, thank you, Banu. So one of the ways in which I frame my argument in the book, as you mentioned, is by looking at the field from which I have learned a lot, queer studies, and how neoliberal Islam as a concept and as a lived reality provides a direct challenge to the existing frames in the field. So neoliberalism has received a lot of very rightful criticism in queer studies. People have written about its sort of taming effects of radical sexual politics and how very privatized family formations have been infiltrating queer movements as ideals, like asking for the right to marriage, asking the right to serve in the military. These have become goals of a movement that used to be much more critical of the state and the family and marriage, etc. So, and the military. So there is that kind of critical trend and critiques of neoliberalism, and I cite many of those scholars from whom I've learned a lot. And then there is the scholarship on Islam, and the way I connect these two is basically by showing how Muslim subjects and Islam in general shows up in this literature or adjacent literature in queer studies when it starts talking about how neoliberal queer life that wants rights and entitlements and marriage and this and that also wants protections from particular forms of homophobia. And then Islam comes in because usually the prototype or the stereotype of the homophobic Muslim male and homophobic Muslim geographies become then targets, right? Like the locations of that homophobia, which then, just Report, for instance, very beautifully wrote about a homo-nationalist world order that emerges from neoliberalism and its homonormativities, which ranks nations according to their homo-friendliness and homophobia as a sign of civilization. And we find queer subjects, I think it's hard to say that all queers were always against, war until 20, 30 years ago, but we see a much more major shift where people think that going and bombing allegedly homophobic countries is just not only justifiable, but it's good for gays or something like that. So there is that critique, but these frameworks then locate Islam and Muslims as always the victims and never the agents of neoliberalism or perpetrators of neoliberalism, which obviously doesn't work for the case of Turkey. So then I think about why this disjuncture happens in queer studies, which I attribute to queer studies' treatment of cultural difference in general. And then I use neoliberal Islam as a jumping point to say, what are the underlying epistemic assumptions of queer studies about queers elsewhere, queers that are culturally, culturally other. And I show how much, as gays and lesbians become markers of modernity, especially in the third world, especially third world in quotes, but especially in the Muslim majority geographies, a lot of other markers of modernity fall out of purview. So nobody talks about capitalism. Nobody talks about neoliberalism. The only sort of perpetrators of modernity are gay and lesbian activists, which is unthinkable. If you look at these countries, they're completely, nobody talks about modern armies. Nobody talks about modern taxation systems. Nobody talks about modern governments, parliaments, but people talk about gays and lesbians. So I try to then bring that back into queer studies to say, how can we rethink how we think, how we treat cultural difference so that we can see and from a sort of transnational feminist perspective as well, so that we see the links, we continue seeing the links. We don't fetishize certain locations as almost like places that might save us from Western imperialism and liberalism. There are no such places, but we do take a, I think, more honest look at the world that we inhabit, and then I think we'll be more able to think of also solutions to things we find problematic. Sorry, this was a bit of a long-winded answer.
No, it's very complicated, but I really appreciate sort of you saying, the arrival of queer studies into a concept assumes that it was never entangled with it, when I think what you show is that over time in history and geography, those entanglements and relations were always there, but you render them visible for the reader who might maybe assume that, queer studies arrives at a location and a time in a potentially objective manner, but it really doesn't. So, really appreciate that. I know that, Nadia has some really great questions too, related to some of your own experiences in terms of these issues, in terms of arrivals into contexts.
Yeah. When I was reading your book, Evren, I was sort of reflecting on my own thinking and political process in terms of arriving to the US, over a couple of years ago. And, some of what you're describing and some what you seem to be grappling with politically are things that I've been thinking through as well in terms of feminist scholarship. So, yeah, there is this, of course, challenging the reifying of cultural difference. Yes, but there is also, as you just talked about, this tendency to romanticize and glorify a kind of untainted other that is not influenced by, or that's resisting colonialism and imperialism. And, in the context of Muslim majority context, that is Islam, and then Islam is, the kind of, the sort of signifier that needs to be defended, of course, from Islamophobia and racism, rightly so, especially in the US. But so I see what, part of what you're doing, aside from, I guess, making an intervention into queer theory, and also contributing to queer of color theory, which often is also very ethnocentric, actually, or US centric. So what you're trying to do is, you are trying to challenge US centrism. That's something that's like on my mind every day. And so I'm just wondering if you can reflect a little bit on that process, how you're going about it and how you got to this as an important political trajectory for you.
Thank you, Nadia. I think we share a lot of, similar, sounds like frustrations, and it comes from, being trained in the US as a sociologist and as a queer studies scholar. And I have learned so much. So I think the frustration also comes from, if I thought that none of this makes sense, I don't know, these people don't know. I learned so much from this amazing wealth of scholarship, but I was continuously frustrated with its blind spots and its US centricism, because it speaks as if it speaks of the world by default. And I'm working on a special issue with one of my colleagues from UC Davis, Rana Jalil, and I are doing a special issue for South Atlantic Quarterly. It's not going to come out for a while, but where we're thinking about the concept of queer of color and racial capitalism, and how these two have been quite US centric as well. When people say race, they mean race in America. In a lot of the scholarship, we don't contextualize a lot of the terms that we think with. And then whiteness becomes a term that circulates globally as if it signifies one clearly defined thing, or of color is used quite, and some transnational feminists have written critiques of these over time, but I think that it's a lot more attractive to think of a general and a bit of a generic people of color or queer of color existence, which then will lead to political solidarities, etc., kind of unproblematically. And I understand those desires, and I even have sympathies for that, but I also see the dangers of them. So for me, there is a bit of a dance in the book, because I also speak back to US scholarship. Like, I'm not completely, and I don't think so I guess with decentering, I don't mean let's just erase US from the stories that we're telling, which we can't anyway, but to really kind of not imagine the US as an, like homogenous thing either, which many, people have very extensively written about, but also not create these radical alterities that don't exist as an alternative. But let us think about the complex histories of US military and economic involvement in the world. But let us also think about its many allies in the Middle East and elsewhere in the world who have very much been complicit with a lot of this. Like, it's nice to think of, a single villain who has single-handedly transformed the world into what we inhabit today, but just history doesn't work like that, and the world doesn't work like that. So I think I try to do this both intellectually and in terms of the theories that I employ and that I try to speak back to. I try to also speak to queer studies in Turkey in different ways, but I also try to show that queer studies in Turkey has not found these concepts useful at all and hasn't engaged with them, because they don't, when you talk about Islam and you only mean Muslim minorities in Europe and in the US, it's just not going to work for a lot of the world.
Yeah, no, that's resonates a lot what you're saying. And so I've also been following more closely, not so much, somewhat in Turkey, but in other places, particularly in Lebanon, where you have actually a strong sort of critical mass of queer, especially queer feminist scholars and activists. And that's kind of, I guess, sort of the other binary that I think exists in terms of queer theorists and scholars, and they're supposedly based in the West, and then they're the activists. But I do find, and I think you're also talking about that, that many of the queer feminist activists are really at the cutting edge of contributing to expanding our ideas of, what queer studies mean.
Very much so, yes.
Yeah, yes. So Banu, but I would also like, again, to encourage the audience, if you have any comments or questions, please share them with us. Okay, Banu?
Yeah, we'll wait for those. But until then, I have another sort of observation and question around, sort of the framework and complexity of your beautiful analysis in terms of highlighting how social movements and political discourse intersect in queer selves and queer identities in Turkey, whether or not you sort of see this analytic approach being useful or not in other geographies and contexts globally.
Let me quickly make sure I understand the question, Banu. So are you asking whether the way in which I show how particular movements and identities intersect might also be the same? Or can I ask you to repeat the question?
Yeah, so, I think in developing your sort of analytic framework or architecture, you sort of show the complexity of what local is and isn't. And I'm wondering, what kind of framework would you sort of recommend, particularly to grad students who maybe are thinking of doing something similar in a different geography or context? What of those elements of your analysis can you sort of say, also consider these, but then what are those that are maybe unique to what you were trying to uncover?
Right. Okay, I see now. Thank you. So I guess one thing that I can recommend is to always look for the mess, and I do talk about that a little bit, like the social mess. There are, I can't imagine any place in the world where there's no contradiction, there's no fights and debates and people disagreeing on the meanings of certain things, or even on the same people who might consider themselves on the left or the right, or however they see the political spectrum. So I think that looking for, I get suspicious of neat stories, like when I hear a very neat story where there's absolutely no mess, no contradiction, nothing, everything like unfolds, like there's there's one seamless singular story, I don't believe it genuinely. I mean, it sounds really nice. And I think that those stories make extremely good theoretical interventions oftentimes. They work, but they do erase certain things in order to be able to crystallize something else to make that theoretical intervention. So my suggestion is always to go find the fights and the arguments and people who seem to have an issue with each other. And so I think that already complicates and multiplies the local. Then there's not one voice that represents, quote unquote, the local. So that's something that I think can be applied to really any place and any field. But I guess the things that were perhaps really unique to Turkey, for instance, the particular political shifts that we have watched unfold, I think are with the AKP are quite specific. So the what seemed to be democratization turning into quite authoritarian state. I mean, there is rising authoritarianisms everywhere in the world. So that is something that I think might resonate with people. But what we're shifting from, and like Turkey's, for instance, history of really staunch secularism, which is one of the things that has made the AKP possible, might be and will be unique to Turkey in some ways. Like so I think that there are some things that won't apply. But I think the general principle of looking for the messy in the social field is something that anyone can take home.
Yeah, no, that's wonderful advice, isn't it? Go look for the mess where your theories are, met their boundaries and their limits. And I think where the strong, powerful narratives come are from those swimming upstream, right? The ones that are sort of telling us the anti-story or the anti-theory, essentially showing us the boundaries and limits of our theoretical expertise. So I really appreciate that. Thank you. I know, Nadia, you have a really great follow-up question, so I'll hand it back to you.
Yeah, although I have to say now I'm tempted. I was going to ask you now about sexual subjectivities, but maybe before doing that, Evren, I was thinking about sort of messiness, and one of the chapters that I enjoyed the whole book, but one of the chapters I guess that stands out for me in terms of ethnography and the kind of messiness of it is that chapter in which you focus on the nightclub and the kind of the dynamics in terms of people who go there, and your own experience. And I was just wondering, I think it would be fun, not just fun, but also really interesting for audience to sort of hear about that messiness and how you found yourself in that situation and the different dynamics. Could you say something about that?
Yeah, of course. And I mean, maybe it's nice to say something about that because I've written more extensively about that fieldwork in other articles, and then I really wanted to put that story in conversation with the Gezi story, so then I had to cut out so much, and I thought, I published it elsewhere, people can always find it somewhere else, so it might be good to say something about it. So the nightclub, this queer club I entered, or I decided was going to be part of the field, when I heard a number of the queer activists at the time I was doing ethnography with refer to it as an apolitical space. And I was interested in queer politics, so then I thought, why not go find out what lack of politics or what the apolitical looks like. And I have found this to be a place where a few things came up in the ethnography, but maybe I feel like you're maybe also asking me to locate myself a little bit and like how my subject. So I started working at the club. I did say that this is for research, so I wasn't deceiving anybody, but I started working there. It was open 2 nights a week at the time. Now it's actually open almost every night of the week. It's still it's hard for queer clubs to continue, but this one has. But anyway, so I was working Friday and Saturday nights. It was open quite late, like until 4 or 5 in the morning. And I did see a very particular kind of working class queerness in the club that was in a bit of a contradistinction from the activists. Not that the activists were wealthy, they were not, but there was more like a habitus distinction between the activists and the queer club night, like queer nightclub goers. And that really affected the way in which people voiced their understandings of the world, what they prioritize. Like a lot in the interviews, people were saying like, look, these people work all week as hairdressers, as retail workers, and then they come have fun one night. And they think activists are just like critical of everything. And it's tiring, right? But then I did find that certain things that activists were complaining about, or I guess critical of, such as the kind of rough, quote unquote, female masculinity of some of the clubbers, were like mostly related to the particular working class masculinities of those subjects. Like, not that they were masculine, but that they would carry worry beads, or they might carry cigarette packs in their socks, or like they act like truckers. Like, it was these things. It wasn't just any masculinity. It was a particular working class masculinity. And then when there were increasingly trans men members of activist groups, they knew how to explain their gender and make a case for it. So having the language of basic things in gender and sexuality studies, gender as a social construction, femininity is as constructed as masculinity, or can be as problematic as masculinity. The moment you have the language to respond, and I do recount a moment where I myself ended up responding to, maybe this is not in the book, maybe it's in the article actually, but I was, there was a women-only door policy, for instance, at the club, and women-only door policy was being critiqued by trans men, and who were becoming kind of more and more numerous in the activist circles. And so somebody asked me, somebody said, I was like, there was a cafe, so like the bar hadn't just opened, and somebody said, my friend, pointing to someone who presented as very much like a cis man, especially given the lack of like access to hormones and things like that at the time, saying like, my friend's a lesbian too, can they also enter the club? And I said, we don't really have rules about it being straight people or lesbians, or it's like trans men and trans women are also welcome at the club. And then they were like, oh really? And I said, yeah, I guess the only people who are not allowed are people who are determined that they're born a man and they're going to die a man. So like, that's the only category. But this was a playful way to summarize, right? Like cis kind of straight male existence as something that's screened in a queer club. But a lot of people who worked at the club, who owned the club, who went to the club, didn't bother with these things. Like, they didn't feel like they needed to explain themselves. Or there were moments where like I found myself having to explain my understanding of my sexuality using some gender studies knowledge, or like insisting on my knowledge of myself, where activists were quite corrective, like if you're a lesbian, you are always a lesbian, you were born a lesbian. And then I had to be like, no, I really wasn't. I don't think, like, I was straight and I was not. Like, it's just so, and it can be like that. So I think having those moments, obviously in a respectful way, and in also a way that like without hiding myself and my subjectivity and what I think, I didn't agree on everything with the people I was working with, just because I think that can be a tendency, because you don't want to be disruptive, you want to be respectful. So I'm going on a little bit, but these are the things that come to my mind.
Yeah, no, super interesting. And that actually then really brings me to the kind of more abstract question that I wanted to ask you about sexual subjectivities, because you're actually asking us in a way to move away from discussions of sexual subjectivities. So can you explain that a bit?
Yeah, of course. I guess I'll be very curious to see what others will write about this in the future, because I think that I'm blaming something on sexual subjectivity and maybe others will blame it on something else. But here's why I propose that we move away from a focus on sexual subjectivity when we look at the effects of sexual modernity in the world, let's say. Because in the scholarship that I have seen that focuses on queerness, contemporary queerness, and queer movements in the Middle East, I have not found ways in which scholars have attempted to or tried to or managed to get out of the colonial authentic binary as long as they focused on the categories of gays and gay, lesbian, or LGBT activism, because of the particular, I think, effect Foucault has had on queer studies, which really centers sexual subjectivity at the heart of modernity as we know it, right? So the transition from sexual acts to sexual subjects, like the kinds of people being such an important marker of modernity. I find that to be a very compelling argument. I like it, I teach it, I am inspired by it, but I refuse to treat gays and lesbians as the only way in which we think of modernity. And that is why I was saying a little earlier, like, that nobody talks about capitalism, nobody talks about other forms of modernity in, let's say, Turkey, in my case, or, you know, the Arab world, in the case of Masad's book, for instance. So a lot of other things fall out of focus. And as we were also talking about in the discussion around Islam and how it is kind of made into, reified as a thing that it's not, it is because it's taken out of its political, economic, social context, right? It's not contextualized. So for me, the move away from sexual subjectivity, not tracing gay as a term, lesbian as a term, but tracing sexual orientation or gender identity rather as terms and how those are debated, help me not get into these traps of, are these people authentic? Or then I have to make the argument, yes, they are, but they're also like not the same thing. I just did not want to talk about, the things I want to talk about were quite different. So it was, I think, a bit of a trick to get around that. But it was also because I make the argument in the book, also using Avery Gordon's work, that there is something about subjectivity that doesn't work for me as someone who's interested in the mess of the social. And that is that it really reduces the complexity of people and of personhood into this one dimension. And I find the symbolic importance and discursive analysis really interesting. Like I do find a lot of the work that was done on this to be really generative and important, but I also see its limits. So I did not want to focus on whether or how much or in what capacity subjects that I'm writing about or the people I'm writing about are gay or lesbian or how they understand themselves. I also, one other thing to mention is that I also want to move away from subjectivity because I am interested in talking about collectives. I am not interested in talking about individuals, especially because of the kind of, I think, political project this book also wants to do, in addition to the intellectual project, that neoliberalism is the individualization of political, economic, and social life. And I'm interested in movements that press against it, and then focusing on the individual sexual or gender identities of these subjects, and a complete injustice, I think, to also their political projects and their political selves.
Yeah. You might have frozen. I mean, it looks like now you're back. Yes. Yeah, I have to say, Evren, I really appreciate your sort of insistence that, you know, we need to pay attention to political economy. I think that often falls off, and you know, you have these culturalist explanations that you just, you know, they're important, as you say, but they're also missing quite a bit, and sometimes really, you know, crucial bits. So yeah, I mean, we're now slowly running out of time, but Banu, maybe one more question.
Yeah, and maybe this is a fun question, Evren, to kind of wrap it up is, you know, is there any particular moment or interaction from your research that really stands out to you in terms of capturing the either complexity, the, you know, the difficulty, or sort of the joy of the work that you were doing?
Yeah, I think like the first thing that comes to my mind, and it's an example I like using, it's an example I already gave, but I can say a little bit more about it, is that meeting between headscarf activists and queer activists. But that story has many layers. It's not just about that meeting. It's also, I mean, I do trace, I think, a kind of a painful history of some of those headscarf activists initially being such vocal proponents of democracy and right. I mean, they're unrecognizable today, right? Their political position, and it's so that. But the surprise bit is like when I tell the story of, you know, like here we have a room full of people where you know, headscarf activists are telling the queer activists that at least in an Islamic utopian society, their private place would be respected, which would never be respected under a secular state. That the secular state will always survey, always intervene in the mahram of any subject. There will be no room. And quoting Judith Butler at length to convince queer activists, which I think that's a fascinating story and quite unexpected for many audiences. And then I also discuss a little bit more that how, and this kind of gets back to Nadia's liberal illiberal question. I hadn't thought about this example at the time you asked about it. But so what happens in that story too is that they say something like, you know, you're inviting the state into your bedroom. And then I talk about using a little bit Sabah Mahmoud's work of how this particular understanding of private versus public, where the mahram equals private equals the bedroom, is itself a very modern and liberal interpretation of the term mahram itself. So everybody in the story is a product of particular histories of modernity. But I think that is a fascinating story that really, I think, interrupts a lot of the assumptions people might make about what, you know, Muslim headscarf activism in Turkey might look like, what queer activism might look like, what kind of conversation they might be able to have. So that is one of my, I think, favorite kind of stories that really surprised me and I think surprises people.
That's wonderful. I'm thinking like your next article will be reading Butler and the Mahram, right? Because essentially it shouldn't happen or it couldn't happen conceptually, but it does. So I'm really appreciative of everything you know, you've shared with us today. I know we're pretty much out of time, so I'll say my thank yous and then I'll pass it to Nadia. But Evren, it was such an absolute pleasure to read your work and to have these amazing conversations with you. The depth of your knowledge and analytics is really, I think, inspiring for all of us. So thank you so much. And I'm hoping to be able to grab a coffee with you because I think you live very close by.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Banu, for these words. I, just want to second those. It was a pleasure to read the book in preparation for this conversation. I'll certainly feel that it has moved my thinking. It has taught me a lot. I'll be trying to also share it with my students. I'm very much looking forward to future work from you. And like Banu, although I don't live in the same town, but not too far away. So hope that maybe we can even have lunch at some point in the future. And I'd like to thank our audience for their participation, and also very much many thanks to Barbara Oberkötter for helping facilitate this event. Okay, so goodbye and thank you very much.